This is Kevin Klinkenberg. Welcome to the Messy City Podcast. Wanted to talk today a little bit about how change comes to professions and to society at large, especially advanced, wealthy, and very highly managed societies like ours in the United States and in a lot of Western countries. This topic kind of came to mind and was spurred to me by a blog post I read the other day, a wonderful little blog, another Substack called Urbanism Speakeasy that I would highly suggest you check out. It's written by Andy, and I'm probably going to butcher your last name, Andy. I'm sorry. It's Bono or Bono. I'm not really sure. It's terrible with a last name like Klinkenberg. I'm always really sensitive to mispronounced names. So I'm sorry if I got that wrong, Andy, but he writes a terrific Substack called Urbanism Speakeasy. And he writes a lot about the traffic engineering profession and the planning professions and critiques of how these professions have gone about their business for a very long time and more or less continue to do so in spite of obvious needs to change and obvious data that shows change would be necessary. So it really kind of caught my attention. And I wanted to talk a little bit about my observations, what I've seen in practice in the world of architecture development, urban design over the last 30 years or so, and just my own reading of history in this world. So I often talk about this in public presentations that I give. And I tend to start with, talking first about food. And so I'm going to start right there because I think it's always an interesting analogy. And food and drink and everything is something that we can all identify with because we all eat. We all eat and drink. We do it every day. We're much more keenly aware of the changes that happen within food and drink, and it's just something that we can all identify with. There's obviously a reason that cooking shows are very, very popular. Why chefs who do cooking shows, and you probably know from previous episodes, I was a big fan of Anthony Bourdain's back in the day and his show. Absolutely adored and loved his show, and how he used food to connect people from all different parts of the world and connect with people. And whether you saw the world the same or differently, no matter what it was, there was a great way to identify with other humans by sitting down and sharing a meal and doing something that you love in your own way. And so I often like to talk about food as an analogy for how our world is changing. And how change can happen. And if you look at it, I kind of start back in the immediate post-World War II era and talk a lot about how our food systems really dramatically changed. And we really instituted a very industrialized, technocratic approach to the growing, production, and delivery of food especially in the 1950s and 60s, and then well into the 70s. And if you're old enough to remember, you probably remember eating, all the sort of meals that you just popped in the microwave, the TV dinners. And it's pretty funny to look back now and see that there were all these different cuisines that were available through TV dinners that were highly promoted. So you had your Mexican dinner and you had your Chinese dinner and you had your Thanksgiving dinner. And it was really very much touted at the time that this was a new world we were entering, and that food is fuel. And with our new industrial, highly, technology-based society, that we're heading towards a George Jetson type future where you were just going to get your food out of a vending machine. And you would pop it in another machine that would heat it up for you, and then you're good to go. And boy, isn't that progress. That is just so much better. It's a much better way for humans to be. It's very futuristic. And obviously that notion of the future, that vision of the future has fallen apart. We pretty much don't tend to see things that way today. Our society has changed a lot. So how did that happen? Well, I think there's obviously a lot of ways you can attribute it to, but I tend to point towards two women that I think had an incredible effect on how we think about food, and that created the way that we think about it today. And one of those was Alice Waters, who opened the restaurant Chez Panisse in Berkeley, California in 1971. Hard to believe now, but over 50 years ago. And Chez Panisse with Alice, she was really one of the very early people to promote the farm-to-table food idea, and really just trying to talk to people about this crazy notion that we should just eat food that is from real ingredients, that's grown in fields with things that we can identify, and we should cook food with real agricultural products and not highly processed industrialized products. The other person who was a little bit older than Alice Waters, but who was very popular in that era, was Julia Child. And Julia Child, obviously the famous chef, and she had a couple of wonderful TV shows. My brother is always talking to me about the wonderful show Jacques and Julia, and encouraging me to watch that with my daughters, which we do from time to time. Really great shows that are still available on YouTube. And Julia Child really talked a lot about the joy of cooking and of food in general. And I love this quote that she had from 1990. She said, "Everybody is overreacting. If fear of food continues, it will be the death of gastronomy in the United States. Fortunately, the French don't suffer from the same hysteria we do. We should enjoy food and have fun. It is one of the simplest and nicest pleasures in life." And I couldn't agree more with her statement there, her philosophy, her viewpoint on all these things, that human pleasure is a really important element of everything we do. And things that don't ultimately connect with human pleasure tend not to survive very long as a trend or as anything important in society. And when you pair together this notion that Julia Child talked a lot about how we should really learn to cook and enjoy food, and how Alice Waters really pushed the notion of farm to table and natural ingredients, you can see what's happened over the last 30 or 40 years as a result, and the incredible growth that we've seen in everything from farmers markets, of which in the 1970s, there were actually less than 2,000 farmers markets in the entire country. Just hard to believe. Now there are, tens of thousands of them around the country. The increase in consumption and manufacture of things like craft food products, craft beer, more wineries. You see even fast food companies over the last decade have shifted a lot of their marketing. Maybe they're not shifting their menu items, that much, but they're certainly shifting their marketing to promote that they're actually using real ingredients more and more. And we can see the impact that has had on how we look at cooking, eating, whether doing that at home or eating out in the last few decades. The farm-to-table idea, which most people in the 1970s would have probably thought was an absolutely nutty idea. Why would we do that? We have this industrial food, we have fast food, we have much better ways, quicker ways to do things. Who's got the time to cook and sit down and eat? And it's just so complicated and hard when we've got this other simple thing that we could do, and I can just get food out of a box. Who would want to do that? Well, farm-to-table is now almost the default for restaurants in the United States. And cooking obviously has seen a major resurgence as well. I think we still find that there are probably generations of people who really have forgotten the art of cooking and maybe didn't pick that up from their parents or their grandparents. But obviously, there's a tremendous growth in the notion and an interest in cooking at home. And why not? Because frankly, it's fun. It's really enjoyable. It's incredibly rewarding to be able to put a few ingredients together and make a meal for yourself at home and have it taste really good. I've always enjoyed cooking myself, and I think as time has gone on, I just enjoy it more and more, and really find myself experimenting a lot more and growing in ways that, I probably wouldn't have expected 40 years ago. And I think that's indicative of a lot of us. We've kind of lost so much from our approach to eating and to growing food. And so I think it's incredibly encouraging what's happened in that world. It's one of the great trends of the last 20, 30, 40 years, this approach to reconnecting with how did your great-grandparents eat? What kind of food were they growing and eating? Because it's not just more enjoyable, it's better for us. It's more sociable. There's only good things that come from it. The second story I like to tell then is how we changed how we build our cities and towns. And just like in the world of agriculture and food, cooking and consumption, we had a major shift in how we thought about our cities and towns in the immediate post-war era. Now, it's also true that most of these ideas that we put in place in the years following World War II were not new. A lot of the ideas and dreams and visions for the city of the future really happened starting in the 19-teens and 20s. But we had, a 20-year period. We basically had a generation where almost nothing was built because of the Great Depression and World War II. And when the war ended, we had such incredible confidence and gusto, and we had the wealth in the United States that other countries didn't have, that we had the ability to just go remake our cities and towns, and we did that. And we did it in ways that probably are hard to comprehend today in terms of the scale and the execution, the quick execution of a lot of very big ideas, and the massive amounts of money that were thrown at it from the federal government on down to state and local governments to private corporations. It was an incredible remake to create this city of the future that many people idealized starting in the 19-teens, really as an outgrowth of World War I and the awful terror that happened in World War I. And people began to think about a different way to be in the 20th century. And we had people who idealized what that could be, and then eventually we had the resources to execute it, and we did that. But it had consequences. Just like our approach to food had consequences that we didn't really comprehend at the time, and that kind of took us away from our human nature, the same thing happened with cities. And starting really in the 1960s, there began to be pushback to what we were doing with our cities and towns. And that came from a lot of different quarters. One of the quarters that I think had an incredible impact was the original historic preservation movement in cities all over the United States, where people began to really question what was going on, why it was happening, and whether this was a good thing. We seem to be losing things that had incredible beauty in favor of things that were giving us a lot of ugliness. And I think people reacted to that again in ways, just like Julia Child talked about that food should be enjoyable. Life in cities and towns should also be enjoyable and beautiful. That was sort of a default for a lot of the human condition for centuries as we gradually built cities and towns. And we seemed to be getting away from that in the mid 20th century. There was one historic preservation in Savannah, Georgia, a banker named Mills Lane, who had an incredible impact on that town, spent an awful lot of his own fortune just doing improvements in the streetscape and the public right-of-way. And I love this quote that he had that says, "The most enlightened preservationists are trying to restore more than buildings. They wish to restore a sense of community and of humane and civilized values in an age of bigness and speed, and too often of loneliness, fear, and conflict." Now, many of those preservationists in those early years were, again, complete outsiders to the professions of planning, building, and development. But they were horrified at what they were seeing, and they were reacting to it. And those preservationists lost many, many battles. If you look at American cities in particular, you can see the scars of incredible buildings and neighborhoods that were demolished in the 1950s all the way through the 1970s, and even into the 80s, there was still a lot of demolition. So they lost a lot of battles, but ultimately they won the war because they began to convince people that we were losing something that touched our humanity very deeply. And while today's preservationists, I often find myself, not necessarily agreeing with in terms of some of their some of the policies and efforts they take on today, I think those early preservationists were incredible heroes in our cities, and they really helped save our cities from ourselves. There are unbelievable, beautiful neighborhoods and cities that would have been torn down if not for the efforts of these people. And now we have those places to enjoy. Future generations have them to enjoy, and they're incredible, valuable places now because the emotional tide eventually turned. People realized that there was value in those old buildings and those old neighborhoods. There was something that connects and resonates with our human nature, and so we saved many of those and we invested in them. And it's a wonderful thing. It's a great thing we did that. Parallel to all those preservationists who were fighting battles in our cities, we had generations of younger people that were starting to study abroad. That initially started in the 1960s in larger numbers, but then really picked up into the 70s and 80s, where young people through programs through high schools and colleges and the Peace Corps and other places, young American people, I should say, were able to get out of their country and go visit places in other parts of the world and see what life was like. So by the time you hit especially let's say the 1980s, many of those European cities and towns that had been destroyed in World War II were rebuilt and were thriving again. And there were generations of young people who, like myself, I include myself in this group, who visited these cities and towns and got to experience an entirely different lifestyle built around walking in urban communities, whether they're small towns or whether they're large cities like Paris or Rome or London, and really marvel at, how wonderful that lifestyle is. And I believe to this day that still had an incredible impact on the young people who were able to do it. And they were able to visit places that they otherwise would not have visited and experience a lifestyle that, for the most part, no longer existed in American cities and towns, which was the idea that you could just live in a place and primarily get around on foot. You could see how this happened later, how this took effect later in the preference for urban living. And over the last 30 years, the number of young people who had a preference for urban living has skyrocketed compared to what it was, say, in the 1970s. I use this quote sometimes, but I remember a developer friend of mine that I talked to who was working on a project in downtown Albuquerque, New Mexico. Probably about 20 years ago, we were talking about his project and who he was targeting for his tenants. And he said it very bluntly. He said, this generation grows up traveling to Europe and they come back wanting to know why America sucks so much. Now, that's not something that, most of us really want to hear, that most Americans want to hear. We love our country, we love our cities, we love our communities. But it really expressed that there was something really missing from what we had done to our cities and towns in the 20th century in our country. And that was the wholehearted embrace of a lifestyle based around new technologies like the car, like other technologies, and machines, instead of using our own feet, our own bodies, to get around, to experience life, to bump into people informally while walking around, and the social nature that comes from that. And that's something that many, many people felt like we really lost, and it has encouraged people to make changes. And there's no question that has driven an enormous change in especially how younger generations see life in American cities and what they want out of them. That does not mean that people won't want to live in suburbs or small towns. It just means that their expectations of what might happen in those places is going to be different going forward. The more people experience the kinds of lifestyles that are available in countries all over the world where you can actually walk, and how natural and enjoyable that seems, the more they're going to push for that in their own community, whether they're in a major urban center or a suburb or a small town. It cuts across all of those. And we're seeing that all over the United States. We're certainly seeing that in ways in my region here in Kansas City that we had hoped for. We had hoped we would see 20 or 30 years ago. And those things are really starting to happen now. So it's pretty incredible to see this, but it's indicative, again, of how change happened. Another element that impacted the change in cities, or I shouldn't probably say another element, but another person who had an incredible impact, was somebody in the planning profession we all know and revere named Jane Jacobs, who was kind of part of the preservation crowd in Greenwich Village in New York City in the 1950s and 60s, but she was obviously much more than that. And she had some legendary battles with Robert Moses, who was arguably the most powerful man in America at that point in time, and who wanted to build a freeway through Greenwich Village. Jane Jacobs was able to rally a group of people and enough opposition to stop that from happening, and then went on to write numerous books about cities and planning and development, including her most famous really being The Death and Life of Great American Cities, although I think all of her books are really interesting and very good. So Jane Jacobs, again, was somebody who was outside the profession at that time and was really on the outside looking in, criticizing what was going on and questioning it and saying, we're missing out on something. Something important is happening here that's not good. And we need to stop what we're doing and think about it and do something different. And I think whatever your own world is, whether you're in architecture development or you're interested in something else, I think you can begin to see this pattern over and over of how change often never comes from within a profession. That was kind of a strange sentence, but maybe a better way of saying it is change rarely happens from within a profession. So whether that's architecture and development and cities, which I talk a lot about, you could also say the same thing about, the environmental movement was in many ways launched by people like Rachel Carson. You can talk about how it comes from, active living and health and healthy living, and how that has come from outside a lot of even the medical profession. it cuts across almost anything that what we see a lot of is that whatever your line of work is, you have ideas and practices that develop, and they tend to become an orthodoxy. Those orthodoxies gets enshrined in procedures, in contracts. At first, they might be really small contracts, experimenting with something new, but eventually they become big and very very regularized and lucrative. And whatever news media covers a particular niche or world really tends to adopt a new orthodoxy and then regurgitate it. Because, the sad reality is that most mass media exists to kind of be a PR organ for professionals and for corporations. I've certainly seen this in the architecture world for decades. And I think it's pretty obvious now across most corporate media, which is why trust in a lot of that media is so historically low. The internet age and social media have given us windows into that so that we can see that a lot of what is put out there is just regurgitating maybe a narrative of some kind. And it's not really thoughtful or questioning, especially when whatever an orthodoxy is, if it has a lot of money or a lot of power behind it, it's rarely going to be questioned in any kind of mass media. And so what happens is, whatever this thing is that's being done, they just persist. And what I see a lot of is that a lot of bad ideas and practices just never really go away, or they're very, very difficult to make go away. So that could be something like the food pyramid. This is a crazy thing. And my wife makes fun of me for complaining about this, but the food pyramid, which has been discredited for like 20 years, it's just, it was really a terrible way to teach children about food. And yet you go to schools and daycares, and was in a doctor's office this morning, and there's food pyramid stuff on the wall. It's just, it takes so long for a lot of ideas that had at one point become orthodoxy to really go away. In the world of cities, you can see this with notions like level of service in traffic engineering, which is a ridiculous notion. We'll just say it that way. Level of service, like so much in the world of traffic engineering, was just a completely and utterly made up idea, not based in anything scientific or historic or in human nature. But it sounds really good. It's, you get a letter grade. You get an A, you get a C. Boy, if you get an F, it must be really bad. That sounds like a really bad thing, like we should do something about. But it's based in nothing. And yet it continues. It continues to be used in every city in the country as if it's fact and as if it has any kind of rational value. I've seen this in the world of architecture with a lot of modern architecture. Most of my architect friends don't really like to admit this, but the reality is the overwhelming majority of people have never liked most modern or contemporary architecture. And that's been true going back, to when it became dominant in the 1950s and still today. And yet nearly every architecture school in the country still teaches modern or contemporary architecture as the only approach. There are a handful of places where you can go get a different outlook or education and experiment with more traditional forms of architecture. But by and large, you cannot. And there's an incredible disconnect between what we see from visual preference surveys and what people actually like and prefer versus what persists in the profession. So what I see, or an observation I've had, is that even when a lot of our ideas and policies and programs fail, the professionals themselves never own up and accept the blame. Instead, we tend to just blame ordinary people and say it's their own fault. So in the world of architecture, we should say, well, people are just stupid. They don't have any taste. They need to be educated, in air quotes, in order to really appreciate this type of architecture that all of us in our tiny little bubble like. In the world of traffic design and city planning, we've spent 100 years building big roadways and highways and making driving fast the default nature of life in American cities. And then people speed everywhere and they do stupid things on the roads. And what do? We blame the people. We don't blame the professionals who created this world. Especially if those professionals are us, if it's we who did that. Instead, it's easier to just say, well, it's those people, those ordinary people with all their flaws. And you can really see this across every walk of life, from the design world to public health to drug wars, if you want to go there, that we create decades of really bad top-down policies and programs that obviously fail, but then we blame the non-policy making humans as the problem. And this is generally how things go until someone challenges a profession, gets traction with it, and upsets the apple cart. That's what happened with Alice Waters and Julia Child, who challenged the way we were thinking. And it took years, but eventually they changed how we do things relating to growing food, cooking food, and eating food. That's what happened with Jane Jacobs, who challenged the planning profession especially and what we were doing. And the planning profession, while certainly not adopting all of her ideas, I think in many ways you could say the planning profession has ignored a lot of her really excellent ideas related to economics of cities, but it's almost entirely adopted Jane Jacobs' critique of walkable mixed-use places and the importance of those in cities. So another thing related to this, next a couple of weeks from now, we've got, as I'm recording this today, it'll probably be a week or so when it comes out. The Congress for the New Urbanism has their annual get-together coming up in Charlotte, North Carolina at CNU 31. And one of the things I see is how even in a reform movement like the New Urbanism, which is what it is, it was a reform movement. It was building on the legacy of the work of people like Jane Jacobs to try to reform the way we build cities and towns and better connect them with our own human natures. And ultimately, reform movements also mature and seem to develop their own orthodoxy. And certainly, as someone who's been involved in that group for going on 25 years, that what I certainly see now is where we used to have robust debates about many, many things, we now have a lot of groupthink. And there's fewer things of real importance that are debated. The opinions of people in the professional class and the culture of the professional class and the politics are pretty much just accepted, widely as reality. And it's not just that a lot of this is kind of silly and disingenuous, but it just gets to a place where it's kind of humorless and kind of boring, to be honest. It's not reality, but what happens is, as this movement has matured and as many of us in it have gotten older, we've just created a comfortable little cocoon for ourselves to kind of feel good about who we are and what we're doing, and really to seek approval of other professional class peers. And that is a way that I think change movements eventually die and go away. And that happens. That's just that's part of the nature of things. As our friend Johnny Sanfilippo, who does the wonderful blog Granola Shotgun, says, everything has a beginning, a middle, and an end. And change movements certainly have a beginning, a middle, and an end. And it might be that the New Urbanism movement is at an end. It's entirely possible. Outside that really tiny microscopic world of new urbanism, what we also see is that we're in a time period right now where a whole lot of things just don't work very well, and trust generally is low in society. I've talked about this before, written about this a little bit, that this is kind of the notion of what's written about as like a fourth turning. There's a book called The Fourth Turning. It sounds a little kind of scary and out there when you hear that phrase, but it's really just about generational change, and that we're in a major era of generational change that's happening, and it's needed. A lot of that change is needed. And as you can see, so much stuff that's not working. I thought I'd share these couple of quotes. Jason Segedy, who's a city planner in Akron, Ohio, and he used to write more regularly, really hasn't written much in a while, but he had this blog that you can find on Tumblr called Notes from the Underground. And here's something he wrote back in 2020. I think it was 2020 or late 2020 or early 2021. I forget the dates, but a couple of quotes that I want to share that I thought were really wise that he said. He said, "People, again, with good reason, have lost faith that big top-down institutions, leaders, and plans are going to fix what ails us. They look around and see many of the most basic of societal functions, be they public health, public safety, or economic security, either not being done competently, or not being done equitably. This has been going on to one degree or another for decades now. For many of us, a world of weakening, increasingly incompetent, and distrusted institutions is the only one that we have ever known. None of this was caused by the pandemic. The pandemic was simply the catalyst that made all of this impossible to ignore." And he goes on to say, "In the future, people will be looking for anything, even simple little things that might demonstrate competence, provide stability, build community, and reestablish trust. They will look locally in their own cities and neighborhoods for this. Some places are going to be able to meet that non-negotiable basic human need much better than others. If you work in community building, your goal should be to make your community one of those places." I would build off of what Jason said there, which Jason is really an excellent writer. I wish he would write more often, and maybe somebody can send him this podcast and encourage him to share what's going on in his world more often. I thought he was always one of the more interesting voices out there in the world of city planning. I would build off of it and say, don't be dismayed. Persist in spite of everything that is going on. So, yeah, I think we're in a major era of generational change, and it can be scary and exciting all at the same time. But change and improvements aren't going to come from within a lot of our failing systems. Change is going to come from the next Jane Jacobs or Julia Child or Rachel Carson. And we should all remember that those people who ask questions, seek deeper answers, and really want things to work for ordinary people are frequently demonized. All you have to do is look at the history of how some of these people that we revere now were treated by the expert class in their own times. I mean, it's shocking. I mean, Jane Jacobs was called, her and her group were called nothing but a bunch of ignorant housewives. They couldn't possibly know what they were talking about. Every one of these people who really took a stand, for things that we find to be common sense today, were treated in terrible ways. So if you head down that path and you feel like somebody who wants to really push one of our professions and try to get it to work better in your community or just for people, understand that you better find some strength, because people are probably going to come after you, and it could get really ugly. It often does for reformers. So be prepared for that. I share all this because I think there I think a lot of change is needed in the way that we plan, develop, and build our cities and towns. I've obviously thought so for 30 years or more, and have been working to try to make those changes. And I'm the kind of person that I'm very sensitive to groupthink. And I think we have to all be really mindful of how groupthink can enter into all of our lives without us really noticing. And one day you think you're an independent thinker, and the next day you realize that everybody around you agrees with you on everything. And that's not a good recipe for getting things done. We have to understand that a lot of what you read and see in the media, whatever media you consume, almost all of it's a distortion field. It's mostly PR. My dad used to tell me all the time when I was a kid, he would say, don't believe anything you hear and only half of what you see. And I think I've taken that to heart. Maybe some of my friends would say I've taken it too much to heart. But I think over time, I have felt like that has been truly justified. And it's important because there's an awful lot of media that seeks to divide us as humans, that seeks to demonize people who are good people trying to do things for their communities, trying to maybe make change that needs to be made, to try to stand up for themselves, their friends, their neighbors. There's just an awful lot of it that is ugly and divisive. And it's important to see through that and understand where that's coming from. And frankly, that a lot of it's just nonsense. I've always felt that it's a good path to go down to try to cultivate friends and colleagues that have wildly different opinions, even some that are really uncomfortable. Whatever your worldview is, it's good to be challenged by somebody who has a very different worldview. Because this is a big, big planet with 8 billion people on it, and lots of different ways of seeing the world, and lots of different ways of experiencing things, and many different values that people have. There is no one value or approach to looking at life. So embrace heterodox views as you have the opportunity, and try to cultivate friends and colleagues that have a diversity of opinions. If you're part of an institution or a group that you really are hoping can succeed long term, it's going to need that diversity of opinion, which is hard to do. It's much harder to do than just surrounding yourself with people who agree with you. But strength and success comes through difficulty and not through comfort. So if you want your group, your institution to not just survive, but to thrive, this is a time period where you really need to seek out and cultivate those diversity of viewpoints about life, about your community itself, and figure out a way to integrate that into what you're doing. What I see, and I think I feel good about about this opinion, is that the institutions, the groups that are single-minded, where it's people who only see the world a certain way, those are all headed for failure in this time period of change. But those people who can really build strength through diversity of opinion, those stand a good chance to succeed and be those leaders that Jason Segedy was referring to in his blog post, to be those people in the community that are islands of stability and competence that we can rally around. So those are some thoughts that I have about how change happens, how it's made, and in the professions and the world that I have been a part of for many years now, and what I see can be useful going forward. So I hope that's helpful to all of you as you think about what is going on in your own little world, whether that's a neighborhood, a community, a larger area, a profession. And I hope that we can all find ways to create new islands of stability and better ways forward for how our communities are and the ways that we live in them, because it's certainly needed as we march deeper into the 21st century. Thank you all for listening. Please feel free to share this podcast, to like it or follow it on whatever platform you use, to let other people know about it. I've got a bunch of great guests scheduled coming up in the next month or month and a half. Really appreciate all of the feedback that I'm getting on the podcast from anybody who sends me a note. You can always send me an email. I'm very easy to find. It's kevinklinkenberg@gmail.com. Send me a note. Let me know what you think, any suggestions you have for guests or topics, and I'll be happy to get to it as time allows. But this has been an enjoyable venture for me. And if you are headed to CNU 31 in Charlotte, I will see you there. Take care, everybody.